Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We have with us David Krueger, who's an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge and a member of Cambridge's Computational and Biological Learning Lab and Machine Learning Group. His research group focuses on deep learning, AI alignment, and AI safety. He's broadly interested in work resulting from out-of-control AI systems. His particular interests include reward modeling and reward gaming, aligning foundational models, understanding learning and generalization in deep learning and foundation models, especially via empirical theory approaches, preventing the development and deployment of socially harmful AI systems, and elaborating and evaluating speculative concerns about more advanced future AI systems. We also have with us Lauro, who's David's PhD student. He's going to be interviewing David, so please welcome both of them with a huge round of applause. During the session, if anyone has a question, they can post it on the swap card, and then at the end of the interview, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Just checking, I don't want to forget, so I mentioned a few people reached out to me on Swapcard, and I'm unfortunately really busy right now, but I'm going to stick around for 45 minutes afterwards, so just come up and grab me in the crowd, and then I think, did you find anywhere in particular I should go to do this informal office hour thing? Okay, yeah, so maybe we'll have a specific destination, but just come up to the front. Yep.
Cool, thanks for the introduction. Maybe to get us started, you can sort of give us your 3-minute pitch on what you work on, and why you think your work is useful for reducing existential risk from AI safety.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I don't exactly have a 3-minute pitch, but I'll say some things about this. So I work on a lot of different topics. I've started this group about 1.5 years ago, and when I started it, my basic philosophy was I'm not very optimistic about existential safety, and none of the things that I've heard about seem that promising to me, so I'll just get a bunch of talented people who understand and care about this problem together and see what happens. And part of it is mentorship and credentialing, so there's kind of a bunch of meta-level stuff like that I'm trying to accomplish here. But just, I can both say descriptively what I am in fact working on and have worked on, and then I'll also say a little bit about what I think is interesting and exciting and how I'm thinking about what I'm trying to accomplish recently. So just in terms of what I have worked on, we've done some work on reward hacking. We've done some work on the science of deep learning, or empirical theory as it was described in the intro. So that's mostly about understanding how learning and generalization occurs, what are the trends that occur during learning. So some people might have heard of things like grokking and double descent, or this issue of spurious features. So as your model is learning, sometimes it's starts off paying attention to some stuff and then switches to paying attention to other stuff. And we'd like to understand, when does that happen? Why does that happen? Can we influence it? That sort of thing. And then also be aware of and have tools to help us detect emerging behavior, emerging trends. So that might include things like deception, for instance, which is very important for alignment and existential safety. Broadly speaking, I guess I'm most interested right now in sort of solidifying our technical understanding of problems relevant for existential safety, both because I think the conversation has been kind of stymied at this level of people just debating different intuitions and predictions for how the future would go for a long time. And I think there are questions that we can actually try to resolve through rigorous technical research. Just to give an example of the kind of question that might include, or maybe a couple examples. One is this question of, if you train a system with supervised learning, will you in fact ever get something that does planning and behaves as if it was doing this long-term goal-directed reasoning? What are the conditions under which that might happen? That's one question. Another example would be people sometimes have assumed, or maybe not, maybe this is just sort of a methodological thing where you sort of assume the worst, but assumed that advanced AI will have sort of superpowers, like the ability to reverse engineer the outside world just from its interactions with a person through a text channel, or through looking at the hardware, floating point errors on the hardware that it's on and stuff like that. So, certainly you can infer some things about, the world just from text data, or from even, data that's from a pretty limited distribution, but I don't think we have a clear sense of how close to that sort of magical, infer everything about the world from some incomplete data, how well that'll work. So that's one part, I guess. Yeah, and then I think besides trying to understand this stuff better as a community and just like move the discussion into a more technical realm, I also want to help like make the case for regulation, for policy about responsible AI development and deployment, and also like provide basically evidence to support policy making, and then also provide like tools for actually enacting effective policy. So that might involve things like monitoring and auditing tools. Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now. The really pithy version of it, I guess, is like figure out what stuff is dangerous and get it banned. Yeah.
Where do you think your views, both in terms of what the main drivers of AIX risk are and what should be done about that, where do you think your views sort of diverge most from the views of other people in the AI safety community?
Yeah, like I think in subtle ways almost everywhere, but it really depends on the people. So I mean, one phenomenon I've observed is, I guess, so there's sort of like the people who have been in this field for a long time, and like the sort of EA Illuminati people who are, the established, power brokers and movers and shakers in this community. And I think there's a disconnect between those communities and sort of the broader EA community, which is very large and growing rapidly. And so there's some, so in general, when I talk to people who I think, have been around longer and thinking about this stuff longer, it seems like we agree more, but I think that sort of the framing that I would use is pretty different from the framing that a lot of people would use, and then these sort of simplistic framings kind of filter down into the broader community, and not just the EA community, but the world at large now, especially as people are paying more attention to this. And so people come up with like very different impressions. Okay, so that's very meta level. On the object level, one thing is I'm just probably a lot more pessimistic about technical research and more optimistic about coordination and governance. So I think that's probably the biggest one. I think there's a lot of, so maybe to give an example of the kind of like differences in framing that I'm talking about, people will often talk about like accident versus misuse. I think this is like a terrible framing because like, 98% of the risk essentially comes from recklessness and negligence, which does not clearly fall into either category. People talk about like solving the alignment problem. I think this is also a terrible framing because I don't think there is a crisp technical problem to be solved here. I think it's like, going to be a collection of hacks and kludges at best, and it's never going to be perfect. And so the idea that we would have something like a perfect solution, I think is like really questionable assumption. And if you have something that's like, in some sense, 99% aligned, that just changes strategically the picture dramatically, because I think now you have this question of like, yeah, you have to really think about like if that's likely to be sufficient to avoid catastrophe. And I think the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is like no. We still need very strong, robust like coordination and governance solutions in that kind of a world. Yeah, maybe that's all I'll say about that for now, unless you have more you want to ask.
Maybe some people might push back on that and say, well, we just need to find a technical solution that that's going to allow us to act sufficiently in the world to stop other actors from building dangerous AGI, and so once we're on a technical level, and once we're far enough to do that, then we're basically we solved most of the problem, and so that's why the problem is mostly technical. So. Yeah,
so is this the pivotal act idea?
This is the pivotal act framing.
Yeah. So I'm not like going to dismiss that completely, but I think Andrew Critch recently wrote something about like why people should not do pivotal acts and not talk about doing pivotal acts, and like this whole idea is very kind of abstract, and then once you start trying to get into the details, it basically looks like very uncooperative with the rest of society, and the sort of thing that like if you told anybody, yeah, our plan is to like build this super powerful thing and then use it to like unilaterally shut down anybody else who tries to build that thing, and then they're like, well, how are you going to do that? And you're like, well, I don't know, I guess we might have to like bomb them and stuff if they don't comply. You know, like that's kind of like where it goes pretty quickly, and I think that's yeah, I haven't heard like a good case for a pivotal act that actually sounds like something I feel comfortable endorsing. So like I don't want to completely dismiss the idea, but it's certainly not the outcome that I think we should be like striving for or hoping for.
Maybe the nicest possible, or like the nice framing of a pivotal act is, or the nice example is solving alignment. And you know, this is sort of maybe what, you know, the OpenAI alignment plan is sort of gesturing towards. Do you think we'll ever reach a stage where we have, you know, enough technical alignment solutions that we can just build a thing that solves the rest of the problem for us?
Yes and no. So I mean, I guess going back to like the alignment, solving alignment not being good framing, I think it's not like it's certainly possible that that could happen. Like we can end up in a future where exactly what you described has happened. However, along the road to that future, there will be, I claim from our current standpoint and just from, you know, I'm very confident this is how this would play out if we don't have much higher coordination. There will be multiple points where people are taking risks that I think are not, you know, that we should not be taking, and there will be multiple points where people are doing things in a way that is extremely undemocratic and unilateral, and I think that just does not look good to me. So, you know, the big hard part of the alignment problem that nobody seems to really be taking very seriously and trying to solve right now at these organizations, or in terms of, you know, the kind of plans that people have, is actually understanding what we're doing well enough that we can say we have high confidence that what we're doing is safe, and that confidence is justified, and it's not just sort of a feeling. And it's not just, oh look, we like did a couple days of red teaming and testing at our organization, so that means that, you know, the rest of the 8 billion people in the world who are much more motivated to use this, you know, in ways that we don't intend because their livelihood might depend on it, for instance, that they're not going to break it. Like, I mean, this is ridiculous. So yeah, so I think the only like responsible way to do it is much more slow and gradual and incremental, and that's, you know, yeah. So I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just like all these other like technical alignment plans. I just view it as kind of like a Hail Mary. And it's true that we're, you know, structurally in this awkward situation where if we don't do it, other people will. And so, you know, you can say everyone's already defecting, so it doesn't matter that much if I defect as well, and like, you know, push forward capabilities. But I'm kind of hoping and aiming for something more where like the norms change. And I think we're at a moment where we have like a lot of opportunity to make that happen. I mean, I think the rest of society is like finally waking up to how big of a deal AI is, and they want to do something about it because they are not happy with, you know, the idea that this is just going to come sweeping through and change everything in a way that nobody can predict or understand or control.
That makes sense. I'll move to a somewhat different topic now,
Sure.
which is more careers and academia versus industry related. Do you wanna share what your journey was like, starting when, you know, you first got interested in machine learning, and all the things that have happened since then, how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so, okay, whenever people ask me this, I'm always like, so how far back should I go? Because it's definitely, you know, into my childhood. So I am 34, I believe, now, so I was born in 1989. And yeah, I sort of got interested, I guess I would say I started thinking seriously about like ethics when I was maybe 13 or so, and broadly adopted like classic utilitarian type of values around then, and was mostly concerned with like global poverty and animal welfare. So, you know, if you put the timeline together, I guess this is around like 2003 or something. So this is before like the whole EA thing. I mean, I think I had encountered Peter Singer sometime in high school, but that was maybe a little bit after I had started to develop these ideas on my own. Yeah, and then at the beginning of my undergrad in 2007, I met somebody who was like a Kurzweil-style singularitarian person, and they were like, hey, if you're a utilitarian, you should recognize that all of the utilities in the future, right? Like we're going to build AI at some point, and then we're going to like colonize the galaxy, and it seems like just influencing that is way more important than anything that's happening right now. Yeah, and so I basically like bit that bullet and have been, you know, sort of maybe gradually backing off from that a little bit over time, based on sort of, I don't know, a lot of factors, but just thinking about like things like infinite ethics and like how unpredictable the future is and how that makes it very difficult to adopt this kind of mindset, or it doesn't really give you much to say, yeah, I'm trying to like maximize future utility. It's like, okay, what does that turn into in terms of your day-to-day actions? So, okay, so now we're at the beginning of undergrad. Throughout my undergrad, I got way more skeptical and cynical and basically decided, oh yeah, actually just building more stuff and like the classic idea that like technology is good and progress is good and economic growth is good and all of this is going to like lead to good outcomes. I became like quite skeptical of that. Basically because I think in reality, you can see that these things are often used in the interests of power, so to speak, and I think if you sort of extrapolate current trends, a lot of, like technology has a lot of potential to become very oppressive, very homogenizing, to reinforce power structures, to rob people of political power. So, you know, first you lose your economic power, but then economic power becomes translatable into political power, and inequality, I think, economic inequality, I think, does lead to political inequality, at least until we have a solution to that problem. And at some point also during my undergrad, I think I was exposed to the idea of AIX risk, or started thinking about it, and basically thought that this was kind of some out there kind of idea, but like seemed, you know, hard to completely dismiss. But I was also of the opinion that real AI, AGI, was probably coming in like 100 years or more, because okay, I have to explain more things. So I did a math degree at this college called Reed College, where they didn't even have computer science. So like I got there and I was immediately like, oh, my goal now is to build AI, but they don't even have a computer science program here. Maybe I'll transfer, but I didn't end up doing it. So there I am, like, you know, trying to learn about AI through every means that I can, sort of having only realized then that this is not actually pure science fiction. This is something people actually do try and study in academia. So I was like, okay, how do, like, you know, what is the field of AI? And you know, trying to figure that out, and studying, you know, psychology and economics and sociology and philosophy and math and physics and like the few computer science courses we have, all this stuff as much as I could to get any grip on it. So I think I learned about like the term machine learning, you know, 2 or 3 years into college. Looked it up online, maybe found some of Andrew Ng's courses, and was like, okay, this is like linear regression, nearest neighbors. This stuff isn't gonna go, like, this isn't gonna give us real AI. It might give us very powerful systems when you scale them up that sort of end up controlling a lot of society in a very dystopian way. But yeah, anyway, so after graduating, trying to figure out what to do with my life for a couple years, trying to be a musician for the first year of that, I stumbled across Jeff Hinton's Coursera course and was like, holy shit, deep learning works. This is 2012, and so AI is actually going to happen in my lifetime probably, and it's probably about to explode and take off, because, you know, I could see the potential of these methods, and particularly the text character RNN text generation demo that from Ilya Sutskever's 2011 paper. And then I got into the field, and I was very curious, right, still the whole time about this AIX risk ideas, and did see that there was some disconnect between that and between what people were actually doing in the field of machine learning and deep learning. So, you know, basically supervised learning versus reinforcement learning is how I'd put it now. So AIX risk has historically sort of assumed something like reinforcement learning, where you have goal-directed behavior and a utility function. And so I just figured, yeah, you know, nobody in the field seems to be taking this seriously. The people on the internet don't seem to be engaging with the field. It must be that the people in the field understand these concerns and have good reasons for not paying attention to them. So then I got, you know, started my master's in 2013 at the University of Montreal in Yashua Bengio's group, and learned, you know, pretty quickly that, first of all, that there was a thing called reinforcement learning, which was exactly, you know, the thing that people on Less Wrong and whatnot were worried about, and also learned that nobody in the field of machine learning, or almost nobody, seemed to be aware of these concerns at all. And that really came to a head in 2014 when Superintelligence was published and, you know, got in the media, and, you know, immediately people in machine learning were like, oh, this is science fiction. This is a bunch of people who don't know anything about the field. And I, you know, started talking to people about that, including, you know, like Yashua and other researchers in the group, and just realized that, you know, people were really ignorant, I felt, and didn't have any good reasons for dismissing it at all. And that's when I really started to realize that, that's when I decided, like, this was actually going to be a big problem. And yeah, so then I did, you know, my master's, did my PhD. Decided after doing an internship at DeepMind, or while I was there, that I probably wanted to go into academia, and year and a half, got this position and started. So throughout my PhD, I was sort of trying in a half-hearted way to do AI safety work while also just trying to publish enough to like have a good CV to get a good position afterwards. And when I took this position, I was still a little bit of that mindset, but I've shifted quite a bit since then to just being like, I don't want to do capabilities research anymore. I want to like focus entirely on safety. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now for the most part.
So you've been in this, you have in this position for almost 2 years now, 1.5 years. What are your experiences so far, especially with regards to how other academics, approach, like talk to you about AI safety, and you talking to them about AI safety? Do you feel like people are responsive to concerns, and you're able to convince some people, or they're approachable, or is it still like you said during your PhD that people are generally sort of pretty dismissive, or like don't like to think about these kinds of concerns?
Yeah, so maybe I'll go back to say a little bit more about my PhD first. So when I started and when I first started talking to people about this, I mean, they basically just said I was like a crazy person. They were like, wow, I thought you were smart, but I guess not, sort of thing. Within a couple years, that sort of changed to at least some superficial shows of respect, where you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, fine, like nothing wrong, and over time it's sort of gotten more, gradually just gotten better and better, the climate in the field overall. I have not talked to as many people as I would like to, other professors and stuff about this, as much as I feel like I'd like to and should. To the extent that I have, I think like once people actually understand where I'm coming from and how it's sort of different from maybe the very simplistic picture that they have in their mind that they've gotten from, sort of maybe just seeing articles with pictures of Terminators on them, maybe with like reading a little bit of content from the AI safety community that sort of takes for granted ideas like, the sort of super intelligence out of nowhere that is totally goal-directed and malign idea. Once they understand like what my concerns and views are, which are much more subtle and much more about sort of different ways in which there could be sort of a gradual erosion of human control, one of which is pretty close to the classic threat model, but I think that's just one example of how it could happen. I think people tend to be somewhat sympathetic to it. I think it's still common for people to think a number of things like, oh, that's kind of far off and there are more pressing concerns, or yeah, I just don't buy that we're gonna like build these really agentic systems and that they're gonna get out of control, or this is really more of a governance problem, which I basically agree with. I think people in machine learning actually tend to be a little bit more grounded in some way in terms of like I think when people actually, other machine learning researchers, understand and acknowledge this problem, they tend to be like, wow, so if we're actually in that situation, if this is a real problem, we're just screwed unless we can like figure out a governance approach to it. And of course they haven't been exposed to all of the ideas that people in this community have about how to address it technically, so maybe they're a bit biased in that way. I would say, I think, yeah, a lot of people are like somewhat sympathetic to it. I think I've made some decent headway with a number of other professors and researchers, and sort of in terms of getting them to like sort of understand why this is a real risk. But yeah, even when people understand it, I think it's somewhat rare for people to feel like a kind of compulsion to like drop everything and work on it. And I think people often somewhat correctly think that the right approach is closer to business as usual, of just like, well, let's just like try and do things well and responsibly and figure out where things are going wrong and try and fix them, and just sort of very like incremental kind of address problems as we see them as they come up approach. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, you've often pointed out that, or like made the point that the general AI safety community somewhat neglects sort of traditional academia. Do you still think that's true after 1.5 years in as a professor? And do you want to say more about that, if so?
Yeah, I think it's more true than I did when I started. Uh, yeah, why is that? I think it's I think I went to like my first EAG a year ago or so, less than a year ago probably. And you know, my experience there was basically like a bunch of people who were sort of getting into the field, asking me like, academia versus industry, and you're like one of those weird people who like think that you should go into academia, so like what's wrong with you, why do you think this, or something, you know, some version of that. And so it just seems to be like a really common view in the community, much more than I would have expected or hoped. So that's kind of, yeah, my impression of where the community is at. In terms of like why I think academia is good, so let me first distinguish between like three different communities here. There is academia, then there is research at AGI labs, like Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI being the ones that have some, you know, significant stated commitment to safety and people who I know and trust who care about these issues. And then there's sort of, you know, the EAG community, less strong community, all these independent researchers, all these new orgs. And yeah, so I think it's just important to recognize that like it's not academia versus non-academia, it's like academia versus these two other communities. And I think the case is like pretty strong in my mind for working at one of these top organizations that is actually building AGI systems. I think it's sort of like a question of personal fit to a large extent, and things like this. I guess I haven't engaged that much with the other part of this, so like these new orgs and these places where they're not like building the AGI, but trying to like do AI safety research. But to the extent that I have, I feel like there's just a number of issues that I see, which have to do with like ignorance of previous and related work, poor communication standards, lack of prioritization of communicating their work, sort of trying to scale rapidly and bringing in sort of a lot of, I would say like low skill in the sense of like not that they aren't intrinsically talented, but just people who don't have a lot of experience and background and training, and just trying to like scale to like large teams of these people, which I think might be harmful in the sense of opportunity cost to them. So like I think you're not going to get as much of of good training potentially by doing something like that as you would if you were like more engaged with traditional machine learning as well. And yeah, I want to say one more thing, which is about sort of if you're doing this kind of research and you're not publishing it and you're not engaging with the machine learning community, I think this is just you're leaving so much value on the table, both because there are just tons of talented people in machine learning who could be interested in this, who will be increasingly interested in this, because you know a lot of people have just been thinking, oh, this is too far off, AI is like a fantasy, and that is changing. That is changing very rapidly because of progress in AI. So there are many people like coming out of the woodwork now who are like, huh, this seems like a real problem, what can I do? And if we have things that we can point them at that are legible to them, then we will get a lot more work out of them. And these are like some of the smartest and most talented people out there, I would say. And then I think it also protects you as an organization. If you don't make your research public and accessible, you can sort of gatekeep it, and people who want to engage in that line of work have to go through you. And that's really harmful because it means that there might be, maybe if you were to publish your work, there would be some established expert who has way more experience and knowledge of related topics to you, who can just come in and like, do better than everything that you and your team has done in a few months. And if that can happen, obviously, that kind of screws over your organization, but that's good for the field, right? And we need to be exposing ourselves to that kind of competitive pressure in order to make the most rapid progress that we can. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
How much time do we have before we take questions? Yeah, okay, cool.
Assuming we have some questions.
Yes,
oh, they're online.
We have
okay,
about 2
it.
questions
Cool.
that we will very quickly try to answer. So David, you mentioned you're increasingly more optimistic about works on cooperation, regulation. Which level of cooperation would you like more people to work on, such as nation level or track 2 dialogue or research lab level
cooperation?
Research level or?
Nation level or track 2 dialogue or research lab level cooperation?
Does anyone know what track 2 dialogue is?
Maybe the person who asked wants to stand up and probably explain.
Okay, so we have researchers, civil society, or government? Was that the three categories? Okay.
Lab level.
Lab, okay. So wait, so government, lab, or or civil society? All right, yeah. I wouldn't say I'm increasingly optimistic about this. I would say, I don't know, maybe I'm the same level of optimistic, which is not that optimistic, but like I'm pretty pessimistic about not doing this. I think just every level. I don't have like super, specific views about this. I guess maybe it's worth saying a few things. Like, I think people need to like talk to each other and get on the same page about this stuff in the first place. So people at different groups, people in different countries and different governments. I think similarly to how there's a bunch of talent that we can try to leverage in the machine learning community, there's tons of talent, in civil society and in other research communities that's very relevant to governance problems. And we're not doing a very good job of leveraging that, I would say. I don't view this as something where like I have, the ideas and the solutions. I mean, I have a couple things that seem somewhat sensible to me, which is to, let's say, try and slow down the field in general, maybe have a moratorium on scaling, maybe monitor compute, maybe have rules against algorithmic manipulation, against building systems that take direct action in the world without human oversight, building systems that are pursuing long-term goals. I think like all of those things are things that we could actually work towards as policy objectives. I think people have often dismissed that as like not realistic, but this is partially because they don't realize that there is and increasingly will be political will for this sort of thing. And I think it's partially because people don't really understand how regulation actually works. So we don't need to codify something to the level of like a complete spec in order to make a law about it. Laws say things like, you may not, recklessly deploy a system that manipulates people in this domain. That is an example of the kind of language that would exist in a law. So we can just put these things into law and let, the existing systems try and figure out where to draw those boundaries and how to enforce them. Yeah, I had something else I wanted to say about this. So I guess just going back to I don't feel like I have the answers per se. I just want to get more people working on this who have the relevant skills and positions of power. And yeah, that's kind of what I think is the most impact that I personally could have here, probably, is just in getting more people to understand and care about the problem and then use their own networks, their own expertise to come up with solutions.
Do you think we're going to see AI activism from civil society groups to try to slow down AI research or improve governance regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and what form it will take. This is another thing, like coming back to differences I have with the community. I think historically I've been sort of deferring to some perception of community consensus that may or may not be correct. I think a lot of people are doing this. And one of the things seems to be, let's not try and do like direct outreach to the public. Let's try and focus our efforts on like machine learning researchers in academia and in industry. That's always seemed like a mistake to me. I think there will be social movements around AI. It's just a question of what form they will take. So I think, we should expect that to happen, and we should think about, what would be good ways in which it could happen and how we can make it more likely to happen in a good way. Yeah.
Yes. So you've encouraged people to publish more. Do you have any suggestions on where they could publish?
Oh, I mean, yeah, like generally speaking, there's 3 conferences in machine learning that are the big ones, and that's NeurIPS, ICML, and ICLR, iClear. So I think that's, if you can publish your work there, that's where you should publish it, basically. If you can't, which is certainly going to be the case, for some work, then there's other venues. I guess another place that we've been submitting some work recently, there's 3 conferences that are more with the FATE communities. This is fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. Did I get the A right? Accountability? Damn. Anyways, I should know. But so this is sort of, you know, the AI ethics community broadly, and I think there's kind of some relationship repair that needs to happen between like AI safety and AI ethics communities in a way. So anyways, there's 3 conferences there. There's FATE-ML, there's FACT, there's FACT, there's AIES, and there's EMO. EAMO, I think, is the acronym. And so I think we're submitting papers to all 3 of those conferences this year as well. And of course, you can always just put it on archive, but like that's not sufficient, right? It also needs to be like written in a language and in a style that the community that you're targeting will understand. Yeah, and I guess it'd be great if you knew, if you're trying to do this, if you knew people in those communities who are not part of this crowd, who you're friends with, who you can get to look at your paper and give you honest feedback about, because that's the best way to understand how it's going to be received.
What is your realistic best case scenario for technical alignment success?
So best case realistic, that was sort of the...
So the question is, what is your realistic best case scenario for technical alignment success?
I feel like realistic and best case are kind of in, in contradiction in this question. I think so most of my hope for the future is coming from a couple places. One is just uncertainty, epistemic humility. Another is like maybe we just get lucky and sort of stuff just works. So even though we don't have justified confidence, even though what we're doing is reckless and irresponsible, it all turns out okay because we just got lucky. And maybe the next big source of hope would be something like once this actually hits the mainstream, which I think it's very much in the process of doing, things are going to change dramatically in a way that's hard to predict and could be a lot better than I sort of expect. Yeah, so that's not a very specific answer, but I guess basically to be clear about sort of the technical aspects of the problem that would be most likely to pay off in one of these we just get lucky scenarios, I think it's basically what people are doing right now. You just do some fine-tuning, do some more fine-tuning, and the thing basically does what you want, and it's not perfect, but it's good enough, and that's all there is to it. So yeah, I don't think, just to be clear, I don't think that's the situation we're in, but it's certainly plausible.
Well, we have just one last question. What is an unpopular way of erosion of human control through AI that deserves more attention?
Interesting. I mean, okay, so I guess I would put it this way, like, I think a likely outcome is sort of analogous to the adaptation of like smartphones and email and other technology, where we're now in a position where if you do not want to use these technologies, you're putting yourself at a major disadvantage. Like, you are essentially required to use these technologies to get access to government services in a number of cases. You will not be able to, like successfully apply for jobs, et cetera, if you're not engaged with these technologies. So I think that's where we're headed by default with AI as well, whether, in the case where it doesn't just, where we don't have like a fast takeoff situation. And I think that probably, like by default, leads to significant value erosion, where we basically have to deprioritize our terminal values in favor of pursuing instrumental goals, as individuals, like, getting hired, getting status, getting resources, and that sort of gradually, turns into the point where the new version of like the smartphone or email is to have like a chip in your brain and then replace more and more of your brain, or like upload yourself into something that is ostensibly sort of you, but like you know, it's very fair to have a lot of skepticism about whether or not you are still meaningfully you, whether or not you have control, or if it's, you know, the government or the large, you know, organizations or companies that are sort of developing these technologies that ultimately are going to have more control once you sort of engage with with the cyborgization technology or whatever. So that's maybe. Yeah, I'm not saying like, oh, this will happen. I think, you know, the future is hard to predict and all that. I'm just saying things of that flavor are kind of how I expect the future to go if we don't have fast takeoff. It's just like you have to use more and more of this technology. You don't have good reasons for trusting it. You know that there are like powerful interests that are somewhat opposed to yours that have a lot more control over the technology than you do. But if you don't engage with it, you're just going to be increasingly shut out of society. And so people do that more and more, and, you know, we kind of end up in this weird place where everyone is optimizing and being optimized for things that nobody really wanted in the first place.
We had a couple more interesting questions, but in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up. Anyone who wants to meet David after the session, we're going to Lola Low at 4:20, so if everyone can gather at the back of the room, I can then take David and everyone else to the room. Thank you so much, David and Lauro, for such an insightful discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.